Soccer Talk podcast, the only podcast that focuses on watching soccer on TV, online and apps. Coming up on this week's show, we have an interview with John Nicholson about his explosive new book. beIN Sports gets added to over-the-air channels. MLS reveals its TV schedule plans for 2020. VAR sucks the life out of the Premier League. Plus, we have letters from you, the listeners, in our mailbag section. My name is Christopher Harris, aka The Gaffer, and I'm joined today by my co-host Kartik Krishnaiyer and special guest John Nicholson, who will be joining us shortly. So Kartik, let's start off by asking what's been your favourite things you've been watching from this past week of football over the holiday break, where it's practically Premier League, almost like a monopoly. I mean, there was some Scottish matches, some championship matches, but what have you been watching?
Yeah, so I watched a couple of those championship matches. I didn't have all the time off that other folks had, or what that I'm traditionally used to having off. So I missed all of Boxing Day live. But the Liga MX final was the best thing I watched this week, both legs. One leg was on FS1 and Fox Deportes. This other leg was on Univision and Dudiene. Funes Mori, and I know this is a sore subject for a lot of MLS fans because he came through FC Dallas' academy. He won the Sueño MLS contest, reality show contest, and then was not offered a contract. Things are different now in MLS. If a guy comes to an academy, he would be offered a contract, but the reality is Funes Mori has gone on to a great career in Argentina and Mexico, scored an incredible bicycle kick at the end of leg one, and then had another decisive goal in leg two that sent the tie to penalties, which Monterrey won, his club Monterrey. So I watched that. Soccer Box with Gary Neville. If you didn't watch those on Boxing Day, I DVR'd all three of them. There was one with Berbatov, one with Wayne Rooney, and an incredible one with Steven Gerrard. I highly recommend you watch this show, which is a Sky show, which they show on NBC, obviously. Gary Neville, and we've sung his praises before, Chris, but he has an uncanny ability to intellectualize football in terms of former players. There are not many that can do it the way he does. He talks about fitness issues, psychological issues, training issues, general football, higher level football discussions, and the one with Gerrard was particularly good. That one was an hour long also, and they talked a lot about specific managers, Houllier, Benitez, for Gerrard, the drinking culture in English football, and Gary Neville very, very probably accurately said part of the reason Manchester United, there was so much talk of Fergie time historically, right, Chris?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Part of the reason Fergie time existed, and part of the reason Manchester United were so good after minute 80, particularly, he said, in the 90s, when Arsene Wenger came to Arsenal, he cut out the drinking culture and kind of changed the culture around English football. But prior to that is Gary Neville said we had cut that out before Liverpool had cut it out, and Arsenal had cut it out, and Leeds had cut it out, and the clubs we were competing with. So that's why we were so strong. I mean, we could feel it when we were playing other teams, that they would drop off in minute 80.
Dumb question here, Kartik, but I mean, I know from this past weekend there was a ton of excess or shoulder content, so to speak.
Yeah.
Where did you watch this, and where can listeners find it?
So I DVR'd everything because I was working. So actually, perhaps had I had the day off, like I typically have had, Boxing Day, I would have just dropped off at the end of the final match. So what I did this year is I DVR'd everything that NBC had. So they had 3 episodes of the Soccer Box on Boxing Day night, the 3 I mentioned. They had obviously Men in Blazers, they always have, and then they had several Premier League downloads. The one with Frank Lampard and Gary Lineker was particularly good also. Yep. With Gary Lineker interviewing Frank Lampard, they showed The Noisy Neighbors again, they showed The Impossible Dream again. So they did a fantastic job with shoulder programming this week, and have to say that also Goal Zone on Sunday was particularly good with the 2 Robbies and Rebecca Lowe after all the VAR controversies. So I watched that. I watched the Liga MX final. Also have to mention, watched ESPN FC on Sunday night. And I know there's been a lot of discussion on social media about Stuart Robson's rant about the Premier League being arrogant and thinking they're better than everyone. I thought it was. I thought he was pretty accurate. Maybe it came across as being kind of bitter because he talked about the other leagues he he broadcasts Serie A, Bundesliga, MLS. Those of you who don't know, I think we've talked about it on the show a lot. Robson is a commentator that does. He does an incredible potpourri of work around football, but he took the opportunity in the discussions of VAR to really slam the Premier League, and also said that he's not convinced on the Wolves goal that was disallowed. Johnny Otto was a foot, not even a foot, an inch offside. Well, he said he's not even convinced looking at the replay that the line was drawn correctly. He thinks there's a strong case he was on.
Yeah, well, so we'll get into that in a minute. We're going to have John Nicholson on the line in a second. But, lots of great things. One more thing to add to that, Kartik, is just that for those listeners who want to watch some of that programming, if you have Fubo TV, you can go back in time. So you can go back, I think, a few days and watch some of that programming just on their electronic program guide. So that's one helpful tip here. But let's add John on. And let's discuss a little bit of what John's thoughts are on VAR, but also to get a glimpse of or an idea of what was his favourite match or favourite programming from this past week. Just a sec.
Well, much of my sort of football, inverted commas, watching actually happens on the radio. I'm a huge fan of football on the radio, so I tend to listen to most games on 5 Live, on the BBC 5 Live. And the one I particularly enjoyed was the Liverpool-Leicester game. Simply because I think I just enjoy the way that Liverpool play so much. Regardless of the fact it's successful, I just love that kind of direct, wide, fast counter-attacking style. For me, it's always been the most exciting sort of football, even going back to childhood. So it's kind of, to me, it just has an eternal pleasure to it. And just to hear them and then obviously I looked up, because you see all the highlights on the Twitter now anyway, and you just look up how all the wingers work for them. Those wingers, they have to be, or the full-backs rather, wing-backs, full-backs, whatever they are, I never know what to call anything anymore. But they must be the best in Europe and best in the world. And they're just so thrilling. That's why I really enjoyed.
I have to ask though, like, what is the VAR experience like on radio? I mean, so you're obviously not seeing the lines and those types of things, but is it more enjoyable or is it just frustrating? What's it like?
Well, I actually feel really sorry for all the commentators, and because if they're in the studio having a discussion, then have to cut to a live game. Because the commentator of the live games always said, we've got a goal, so, we'll go to the goal. You go, we haven't got a goal. Sorry, it's been ruled out. And I feel really sorry for them because it breaks up all the flow of it. I wouldn't say it's exciting. I think it rather deadens the experience because every time a goal is declared, you think, well, is it really? Is it? I mean, even yesterday, there was the Wolves goal, or so-called goal, was declared to be definitely a goal, and Mark Lawrenson, who was doing the co-com, said, that's onside. And I said, hang on, it's VAR. Oh, no, it's not onside, it's offside. And so, you kind of, it is very much coitus interruptus, I think, really.
We've almost gotten to the point where we should call a goal a semi-goal. You know what I mean? Just until we know whether it's a full-on goal or not.
It is. It's kind of like, it's not the full fat goal, it's the fat-free goal. You only get the full fat goal after the VAR.
So just to add to that too, in terms of what I watched from this past week that was the most enjoyable for me, had to be the Man City Wolves game. I mean, Wolves to me is a club that I've always had a soft spot for, even from when I was a kid. I don't know if it was the kit or the name or the stadium, Molineux. It sounds like just I don't know, so amazing. But the way that Nuno's got this team playing, I mean, both in this Man City match where, I mean, deserved performance there, but even in the other matches too, all weekend long, Wolves and actually Sheffield United too have been just a joy to watch. Now, go ahead, John. I was going
to say that Wolves side is really really interesting to watch because Adama Traore used to play for Middlesbrough, and I know he wasn't that shape when he played for Middlesbrough, and so I am crediting this enormous muscular development that he's undergone. It must have been the Teesside diet. So it's Parmos, it's chicken, just essentially deep fried chicken and cheese. That'll make anybody big. So I'm taking some Teesside credit for the performance of Traore these days. He is so fast. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, it's interesting. In Kartik, you probably remember this too, in terms of Traore when he was playing for Borough last season or the last couple of years. He was so fast, but he'd almost like run into a brick wall. He'd run into the last defender and stop, and then get stuck.
And his technique, John, has gotten much better since he got to Wolves. That's another thing I noticed. He just was pacey at Borough. Now he's got some trick moves. He has some control of the ball. He's become a much better player.
Yeah, he's learned that you actually have to look up while running with the ball to know what to do with it next, which he never used to do at the Borough. He'd just set off. Sometimes he'd set off and he didn't even have the ball. It was ridiculous. So, he has. His game's come on a lot. I mean, obviously, the manager, Nuno, must have really taken him into hand, really. And, because he was such a lethal weapon in terms of speed, he just had nothing else. But, of course, now he's got added all this to his game. So, fantastic, really.
So we have to talk about the one topic that came up from this past weekend, which came up so many times. It was like almost every major match this weekend it came up. VAR. There's been so many examples of why the rules of football need to change in order to keep up with VAR to be used in a meaningful manner. And personally, which I'm being kind of tongue-in-cheek here, a little bit at least, I blame Sean Ingle from the Football Weekly podcast, because anyone who listens to the Football Weekly podcast probably about 10 years ago, Sean would go on episode after episode, every single episode, saying, this is ridiculous. We need to have video technology. And here we are, probably about 10 years later, we have it. Sean's been pretty quiet on the topic as of late. But, it's just a complete and utter mess. And the thing is to me, at the end of the day, the reason that the offside rule was introduced way back when, 50 to 100 years ago, whatever it was because people were what British would call goal hanging and what the Americans would call cherry picking. Standing, near the goal, just trying to knock the ball in the back of the net. And we're at a point, too, where it's down to the millimetre, which is so frustrating to watch. There were so many games this past weekend, whether it was Norwich against Spurs, Wolves against Liverpool, or these games where the matches, you're kind of rooting for the underdog, and it seems that the underdog in most of the examples were the ones that got screwed in this. And it does take out the enjoyment of the game to think that, maybe Norwich can beat Spurs because of this one call where Pukki is offside by, 2 or 3 inches or 2 or 3 millimetres. Kartik, what's your take on this? I know you watched a lot of Premier League football.
Yeah, and I guess everyone who follows me on Twitter knows my take on it, that I think that there are things that about the sport of football and natural reactions of players, managers, supporters that are being neutered by the way VAR has been implemented. Now, then people get into theoretical discussions with me, and I don't want to. I know I'm going to offend a lot of people here. Most of the people who argue with me are Americans who are used to their sports starting and stopping constantly, right? Mm-hmm. And they don't seem to get the exhilaration of being in a ground if you're a Wolves supporter and you get that goal right before halftime, and it turns out Johnny is a toenail off when he placed the ball to the player who scored. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Stuart Robson actually believes the line might have been drawn incorrectly, and that it was subjective the way the line was drawn. He delved into the debate last night saying that. So I think that there's so much about the sport that we love, and we saw this with the Women's World Cup this past summer, that has just been torn apart by VAR and the way it's been implemented. Now, is there technology? Robbie Mustoe talked about this on NBC's coverage this weekend. Is there technology that could make it more seamless, give you an instant decision? I don't know if we have that yet, but until we have that, I think it's too disruptive to the way football is played. And I'm also, as I pointed out again on Twitter, disappointed that it seems like it's the underdogs. This league has huge inequities to begin with, the Premier League. It's not a fair fight. It's not a fair competition. And I know we're going to get into a little bit of that when we talk to John about his book. It doesn't have all the of fairness 20, 25, 30 years ago. Now, it seems like all of these VAR calls are going Wolves, Norwich, Sheffield United. And it just leaves a very bad taste in the mouth of most neutrals, I think, and certainly of club supporters and of players and managers. You've seen the post-match interviews with the Chris Wilders and the Nunos and the managers that the wrong end of our decisions. So I can't register enough my displeasure with it.
Now, John, your latest book is Can We Have Our Football Back? I haven't had a chance to read it yet. Kartik has, but is there any discussion of VAR in there? If not, what's your take on it in terms of being somebody who writes for Football 365, who's very much kind of the voice of the people in terms of kind of the average football supporter in the UK, and oftentimes you raise a lot of topics that many others do not cover.
I don't touch on it in detail in the book because I felt as if I'd covered it so much in so many pieces over the last couple of years. However, my basic position on it is I'm against it philosophically as much as for any other reason. I've always been against it. I was against its introduction. I'm against it as a concept because I think sport is a human endeavour. And what we try to do when we play sport is we try to play it to the best of our ability while accepting that we will make mistakes and, things won't go right. And that is the essence of what sport is. And what technology, when you bring it into sport, is doing is taking away the humanity of it and judging it like it's science. And there's facts and there's fictions and we draw lines, and that isn't what sport is to me. I think that the mistakes are the grit that makes the pearl. Now, that's a philosophical position, and I'm that kind of guy. I'm what I call a close enough for rock and roll guy, which just means I'm not bothered if the guitar is just a little bit out of tune. It's close enough for rock and roll. But other people aren't like that. Other people want every decision to be correct, and it really bothers them if the decisions aren't correct. And it's never bothered me that 5 or 6% of decisions that referees make are wrong. I see that as intrinsic to the nature of humans playing sport. So it was also obvious to me that when it was introduced, all it would essentially do was introduce another layer of human error into it. So now we've got people discussing whether the people who are looking at the screen are getting it any more right than the people who are looking at it on the pitch, the referees on the pitch. And I just don't think, I just don't see any way to resolve this. The only way to resolve it, you either have it and you accept things will be wrong, or you don't have it and you accept things will be wrong. Now, I think that given exactly as KK says there about how it is interrupting the flow of energy from game to crowd, and how basically football's great money shot is the goal, and now you've devalued that massively by having a kind of this coitus interruptus moment. It's worth bearing in mind that football became the biggest, most popular sport on earth, and also one of the richest, by not having VAR. I would, if I was investing money in football, I would be worried that I'm devaluing my brand and devaluing my investments by making football less compelling, by turning people off it. So I think the longer people say it's here to stay, I'm not so sure it is. I'm really not. I think when you've got crowds in stadiums who've paid 50 quid a ticket chanting "fuck VAR," I think a rule change like this, or a kind of a technology change, can't withstand infinite amounts of negativity from press, high-profile pundits, and the paying customers. So I think we'll look back on it as a temporary aberration of madness, and that I was right all along. That's the most important thing to realise, is that I was right and everyone else was wrong.
Yeah, and I guess in many ways too, it's kind of who is in power to make those decisions that ultimately will impact the sport of football. So whether it's FIFA at their level, in terms of IFAB or the PGMOL or the Premier League themselves, which the way that the Premier League has brought out VAR, it seems to be almost like branded kind of with the logo, and it's very much a Premier League experience with the marketing and the colours. But if anything, it's probably been the worst rollout of all the VARs from around Major League Soccer, Bundesliga, around the different leagues, the top leagues in the world.
One quick thing, Chris, that I want to touch on what John said, and it's so important, is the extra layer of subjectivity, because the proponents of VAR for years sold this as we're taking the human error. And I agree with John, human error, and some of the most compelling discussions we have, like, for example, with Leeds United supporters, is about 1975 and the European Cup final against Bayern, or the UEFA Cup final against AC Milan, where they lost on officiating decisions. It's part of what we talk about in the sport. VAR proponents for years, John, sold us on, we're going to take the subjectivity out of it, the human error out of it, and all you're going to have is perfect officiating. Well, I would state that I believe that the additional layer of subjectivity you mentioned, John, that you rightly said before this was implemented would be there, has increased the margin of error in terms of these calls. And now we have another set of eyes and another set of opinions and another set of interpretations that are taking football even further and further away from the norm and further away from the supporters who made it the most popular game in the world.
It's also worth bearing in mind that the rules of the game were set for a game that is not played with this kind of technological scrutiny. So the offside law, as it was there and was judged upon with human eyes, not with a lens and a slow motion camera. So, we're trying to, in one sense, introduce digital rules to an analog game, and that's why it doesn't really work, because we're looking at where the player's leg or arm or knee or beard, in Pookie's case, was when the ball was played, but we don't really know when the ball was played, because is it when the foot first touches the ball, or is it when the passer's foot touches the ball and moves the ball, or is it when the ball leaves the foot? We haven't got a ruling on that because we never needed one. So we're trying to force a square peg into a round hole. And that's another reason why there's just so much discontent about it. It's a kind of technology made for a world that the rules of football were not crafted in. So is there any surprise it doesn't work? But I have to say, even if it worked 100% of the time, all the time, I would still be philosophically opposed to it. I just don't like the idea that we edit our reality after the fact. I think it's a one-shot deal. That's what's great about sport. It's a one-shot deal. You try and do your best. Mostly you get it right, sometimes you get it wrong. We don't ask players who make mistakes to go back and take the penalty again because they hit it the wrong over the bar or something. I'm not sure why we're so sort of sensitive about decisions that are made about, certain things that happen, but only in certain parts of the pitch. One of the pieces I wrote a couple of years ago was saying how I believe football is you can't divide it up. This bit is important, but this bit isn't. So we'll use the technology for the first phase that leads to a goal, but not the fourth phase prior to that. I think football is all interconnected. What happens if, say, Leicester are playing, they get a throw-in in their own third, someone throws it into Maddison, who boots it long to Vardy, and who scores a goal? What happens if then we see that actually that throw-in was incorrectly given to them? We don't go back and cancel the goal out because that's deemed too far away. Now, that's just silly, isn't it? You see, because once you introduce VAR, once you introduce the principle of we must get decisions right, then you're going to introduce it for everything. You either have it for nothing or have it for everything, because otherwise you've exponentially increased the degree of unfairness. Because it's just unfair that, he handballed it 8 moves back, but we only take the VAR for 3 moves. So, it's just not right, is it? All you're doing is just making people more and more frustrated. Mm-hmm. And, you can see this is why people are so angry about it now, It's creating more problems.
Yeah, and this is an ideal segue to talk about your book, John, because Can We Have Our Football Back? Really talks about, television in many ways and the impact that television has had on watching football, especially the Premier League, but all major football leagues. But the VAR leads into that in terms of, these types of things have changed the nature of how we experience the game. So for the listeners who aren't familiar with the book yet, what's the concept of the book and the main points that it emphasizes?
I wrote it because I just for years have had a really gnawing sense of discontentment about the Premier League and so many aspects of it, which most of which rotated around the money, and that rotates around the fees paid for rights, for broadcast rights. That's really where the big money's come from, and that's really what's changed the nature of football. And obviously, as you say, VAR is a televisual thing. Nobody who ever went to a football ground sat there thinking, I wish we could just stop play and look at that again and get another decision. We just accepted what happened, then we went home. But television audiences, because they've already got it all there to look at, they've effectively, the demand has come from that. So it's the whole VR thing is inextricably linked with football being largely a televisual sport. Indeed, one of the things I felt discontented about was the fact that fans who go to games didn't seem to matter anymore. They get pushed from pillar to post, kick-off times are made incredibly inconvenient for people without any concern. Ticket prices have been going up largely most of the time. The Premier League have tried to pass off the idea that half of the tickets are £30 or under, as though £30 isn't a load of money. And I felt as if the Premier League had normalised a kind of extreme economic model and sold it to us as though it was kind of nothing to worry about. And I just found the whole pernicious effect of the wealth disturbing on a kind of moral level, really. I don't think we should be afraid to say that we find it immoral that somebody might earn £350,000 a week and then get £75,000 if he actually plays, which was Alexis Sanchez's case at Manchester United. I just felt this gnawing sense of something wasn't right. And when I spoke to loads of people about it, and I spoke to a lot of people in broadcasting and in the game itself about it, this was a view which was commonly shared, that we had this feeling like, this isn't the game we loved, that we grew up with, something's happened. So I wrote the book to try and pull all of this together.
Now, John, I mean, for TV viewers, like most of the listeners are listening to the show, I mean, we're kind of reaping the rewards of the Premier League in terms of, all the matches being available. Actually, we can watch any of the matches in America, just as one example. The television coverage is one of the best in the world. The Bundesliga is probably a little bit better in terms of the production value, but the amount of cameras in the stadium. Oftentimes I feel that almost going to a match and being in the ground is sometimes not as good of an experience as watching it on television, because television, you've got all the replays, you've got so many things you can take advantage of that you couldn't in the actual stadium itself. In some ways, though, too, I mean, as kind of playing devil's advocate, I'm watching these matches, and most of those stadiums are full. I mean, there's very few empty seats. So the Premier League and the Premier League clubs are probably saying, like, well, it's not really impacting attendance that much. It's really not impacting. We don't have as much crowd trouble as before. So they may say, like, what's the problem? Like, they don't see a problem. Do you think that they're thinking along those lines?
Well, I certainly think that the Premier League have, in their 27-year-long propaganda campaign, have cleverly managed to conflate the popularity of football with the popularity of their brand and of their economic model. But of course, football has always been popular. People love football. The biggest crowds in the UK for most clubs came in the 40s and 50s and have still yet to be beaten. People have always gone to football in extraordinary numbers, and indeed they still do. And it's worth saying this, that there are more attendances at games that are not the Premier League than there are if you add up all the Premier League attendances. In other words, football is just the British game. It is, in Scotland, where I live, it is the highest attended league per capita. For the highest amount percentage of the population of the country go to watch football in the whole of Europe. And we're only a small country, but it's kind of like where I live, there are within 20 miles of where I live, there are 4 professional clubs, and they're just in a very small kind of very small towns. It just goes to prove how popular and how pervasive the popularity of football is. However, I wouldn't conflate the fact that people are loyal to football with they're always being happy with how it's played and with the cost of playing it. Because, of course, what we've done, particularly in the Premier League, is disenfranchise large amounts of the working class, they basically elevated football to its status as the major sport because it's too expensive. And while other people took their place, that doesn't mean to say that that doesn't mean to say this is the ideal situation. I think it was the people's game, and now it's become an elite sort of people's game, which is no longer available to regular people. And I think the economic model that brought us to this position is a pernicious one that damages both the society, the economy, and even the planet. I mean, I do a whole thing in the book on how the promulgation of extreme wealth is at the core of the climate crisis we suffer from. Because the only point of being rich is to be able to buy loads of stuff. And we know we have to stop consuming stuff in order to save the resources of the planet and to stop global warming. So in a kind of a rather elastic move, I consider the Earth is dying because of Alexis Sanchez.
Now, Kartik, you bought John's book. You've read John's book. What questions do you have for John?
I have a few, and I have to say, I'm not trying to make this a love fest, but I agree with 95% of what's in this book, because listeners of this show know that I've been, for many years, and Chris, you and I have had some heated discussions about this, disappointed and growing from disappointment to disgusted with the accessibility of the Premier League, the kind of oligarch structure of the Premier League. I've drifted in my own preferences towards the Bundesliga, not because I think the football's better, but because they have an economic model, and there's still flaws there, don't get me wrong, but they have an economic model that still puts supporters and community above the globalization and the mass wealth. But John, I want to ask you about accessibility specifically, because you make a great points in your book about Sky. It's the same points I hear from my supporter friends in the UK. And the ticket prices, which have limited accessibility, have limited the ability for the working class to go to football matches, to travel, to follow their teams away from home in football matches, and the kickoff times due to Sky, which have prevented working class fans from, let's say, Newcastle, Sunderland, Borough, from the north east of the country, getting down to London for a late kickoff on a Sunday because they can't get back. There's no train that's going to get them back in time for work the next day. Expand a little bit more on your thoughts on that.
Well, I think this is the outworkings of the cultural and economic thinking that is the model behind the Premier League, which is that the actual people in the ground have been disregarded all along. Now, we can say that people are still turning up, and that is absolutely true. But without fans, football isn't a product that you can sell at all. There's nobody paying broadcast rights fees for games played out to empty grounds. So my approach to this is that the fans are and the kind of foot soldiers, as it were, of football are the most important people. They're who it is played for. And without our money, without our participation, without our presence, it all goes away. All the wealth and riches and power, they all disappear. But without, to put it in a basic way, we're the customer, and they're selling us a product. And if we ain't buying it, for whatever reason, be it economic or moral or ecological, then they ain't got a product. So I feel as though if we are discontented with this state of affairs, and I think we are, and I think it is well proven that football is the most popular sport in Britain, and there is a huge appetite to watch it on television, because when it's on free-to-air, up to 30 million people will watch a game. 30.4 million people watched England play Croatia in the World Cup semi-final in 2018, which is the single highest single-channel audience ever in the history of UK broadcasting. The only two things have been higher, but they were broadcast across two channels. This was just on ITV. So we know there's a huge demand to watch it on TV, but there is not a huge demand, never has been, still isn't, probably never will be, to pay to watch football on TV. The audiences are relatively modest, ranging from anything below 200,000 on BT Sport up to 2 million at best, really, on Sky. Sky showed 128 games last year. 112 of them didn't get 2 million. So we know that there's a huge resistance to paying to watch football. Now, why would that be? Well, I suggest that people who love football know one thing about it. It's incredibly inconsistent. It's the only thing that we go and watch week after week that is often shite for years on end. And you see terrible games, but you still go back to see your club the next week. That makes football a really unique product. But we know that when it comes to paying a subscription of, whatever it is, up to £70 a month to watch it, that's not good value. Because, it's one thing to watch your own team. It's another to watch West Ham v Southampton melt your eyeballs and pay 10 quid for the privilege. So I think what the whole model has done has separated the passion of football fans from the football. I think and in the book I explore how I think it's alienated people from the game. And what it's done to our kind of, even down to our mental health, to see these billionaires kicking a ball around to very little entertainment value in order to make themselves and everyone else in the game rich, but make us poorer. So it's very hard to actually just slice one bit. The whole book is very much, it's like if you're familiar with progressive rock, it's like a concept album. You can't divide off one track. You've got to listen to the whole thing. So there's a lot of points that I'm making. Really, they're all interconnected.
It's a point I make about a Pink Floyd album, Chris. You'll appreciate this. The Wall 40th anniversary was a couple of weeks ago, and people were taking individual tracks and listening to it, and I said, you can't do that. Listen to the whole thing. Yeah.
Now, John, I mean, a lot of this can be attributed back to Sky Sports and just the creation of the Premier League in terms of many of the issues that we have today where I see the Premier League as really not a league of England and Wales, but really more of a global league that happens to be situated in England and Wales, where the matches are played there. And it is a global audience. It's a massive global audience and massive global TV revenue fees that have been paid in to watch this global event. And it's something, too, you can go on social media yesterday or this past weekend and just see people from around the world just talking about these matches, whether in Africa, Asia, Australasia, Americas, you name it. But for you, John, though, what if Sky Sports never happened and the Premier League never happened? What's your thoughts on where we would be today? I mean, in terms of what was the first division? Would it have stayed the first division? How would things look differently if Sky Sports hadn't entered the market? Right.
Well, I'll answer that in a minute, but just to go back to your previous point about it being a globally huge thing, I thought that was the case too, and then I started to look into the numbers. Now, typically, and the numbers are very opaque, right? In other words, they're very hard to get hold of, and to get hold of accurate numbers and to what they refer to, that made me suspicious from the start. If I've got something that's really successful, which billions of people are watching, I'm shouting about it. I'm not keeping it quiet. But anyway, it turns out the average global audience for any Premier League game, and this is the average, is 10 million. So obviously some will be 2 million, some will be 50 million. But the average per game is 10 million. So in every round of matches, of 10 matches, about 100 million people, possibly at the very maximum, though it won't be that because people will watch more than one game, are watching it. Now, we live on a planet, of 7.2 billion people. So I think we can see that almost nobody's watching the Premier League almost all of the time. And it isn't really something which is as big as we think it is. Now, where it is big, and again, the Premier League has been very clever here in conflating the fact it's the most watched league in the world, which it absolutely is the most watched, with it being incredibly popular. They often roll total viewer numbers into one big ball to try and sell it as incredibly popular. I'll give you an example. The Premier League states that 46.2 million people in the UK watched the Premier League. I quote that, watched the Premier League on TV in 2018-19. Now, I thought there's only 65 million people in Britain. I thought 46 million people did not watch it. But it turns out what it is across the whole 9-month season, that 46 million counts anybody who has seen 3 consecutive minutes across 9 months. Now, my missus has watched 3 consecutive minutes of Premier League football and has absolutely no desire to be counted as a viewer of it because she doesn't like football or is interested in it at all. So, what you can see is that we start to roll numbers together and say things about them which suggest something which grows as an idea in our head. So we think everybody's watching the Premier League, but no, it's not. There's a lot of people have seen a little bit and aren't really that interested, but they're counted too. What we think when we hear watch the Premier League is watched a game, but it isn't that. The figures are based on 3 minutes consecutively. You're counted as a viewer of a Premier League match if you've watched 3 minutes. So just wanted to put that caveat in there, that we all think, and it is almost a cognitive dissonance about this, we all think it's incredibly popular, and you go anywhere in the world and people will talk about it. And that is true, because it is the most watched league, but the numbers in and of themselves are not that great. Just by contrast, in 2015, Top Gear, one programme, one show, had an audience of 350 million. So with that 10 million per game starts to look a little bit more weedy when you put it up against something that's genuinely popular. Now, what was your other question, Chris? Go off on one there.
It's okay, no worries. The other question was what would have happened to the First Division or English football without Sky Sports coming in the 90s?
I mean, we needed investment in football desperately because for too long, English stadiums and English clubs had treated supporters like so much cattle, which explained a lot of things like the heinous Bradford Fire and all the other troubles in Hillsborough that we had in the 80s. And that was through lack of investment, largely because directors had hived off the profits. There's always been plenty of money to be made in football, and they'd never been invested in grounds. So we certainly needed something to change. But did we need to lock football away behind a paywall? And what effect has that had on our society when you deny access to the most popular sport to the vast majority of people? And I suggest that we've suffered a huge negative impact of that, and that it's taken us down an economic route that we ought never to have gone. Had it never happened, I think we would have less money in the game, which I would consider a good thing. I think we could have regulated better to ensure that a certain percentage of the profits from the larger clubs were distributed further down the league. That's got worse over the years, the drip down effect. And I think there was lots of actions we could have took in terms of structure and organisation and funding of the game to still ensure it was healthy, but just not that it was a place where you could become a billionaire overnight, or one that would attract Russian oligarchs or Middle Eastern oil tycoons to invest in. I don't see those investments as a good thing. I think they're probably the root cause of many people's discontent with it, really.
Now, John.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead, Kartik.
Yeah, John, I wanted to ask you again about Sky Sports, because you talk about in the book kind of the anti-intellectual drift of football coverage coming from Sky versus what we tend to see on the BBC and ITV. And it's something I've complained a lot about on this show the last few seasons, is that I've even noticed the television coverage in the on NBC, which has been quite good compared to Sky, of the Premier League becoming more talking points, more propaganda, more league fluff.
Soap opera.
Yeah, soap opera. Do you think that drift is down specifically to Sky and the Premier League, or is it a general direction of the kind of newer fan that the Premier League has attracted? This higher end fan without roots in football, without the historical basis and historical knowledge of football in England?
That's a really interesting question, KK. I don't know if I've got a really kind of good glib answer to that. I think that's part of a broader societal trend towards kind of instant gratification. So detailed, more intellectual, cultured discussion, let's call it slow food, takes a backseat to fast food and to a quick hit. So we'll have a lot more contention about Paul Pogba, for example. I mean, the Pogba thing is a very good example of this. The papers and Sky too are obsessed with Pogba, and and they always, and this is again one of the products of it becomes such a wealthy game, is we've commodified footballers so that they are as though they are products on a shelf. And we know this because, like, for example, Pogba won't be just called Paul Pogba. He'll be £90 million Paul Pogba. And or he's £300,000 or £400,000 a week Paul Pogba. So I think the way that we're sold football in those more shallow discussions is part of that, what you might call clickbait culture, I guess. But that being said, I think the quality of football programmes and analysis in the UK has probably never been better than it is now. I think we have seen a rise of a punditocracy which does its work. There are still some examples who don't, but I think most of them do. On the radio, this is why I listen to the radio all the time, it is absolutely brilliant. I mean, I consider it university-grade education. You get everything in terms of details with tactics. You get everything in terms of history. I just think it is a different sort of class of product on the radio, really. So, but, the worst aspects of it, sidebar of shame, as we call it in the UK, aspect of it, is certainly a product of the modern media mentality, really.
All right, John, so actually, for those listeners who are curious about the book, so I know, like, for example, I mean, it's available in many different places, but what would you recommend is the best place that they go and buy it? And then the second question is, if you can give us a little bit, like maybe a little teaser too, about some of the other content that's in the book that will entice people to go ahead and order the copy today.
Well, the best place to get it from, where I make the most money from, is just direct from my website, which is johnnicholsonwriter.co.uk. We ship books all over the world. It's been massively popular. We've sold thousands and thousands of copies, and it's really pushed out an open door for a lot of people. Let's think. I interviewed a lot of people in the media and in football for this. So, for example, I talked to Niall Sloan, who's the head of ITV Sport, and he told me basically a lot of inside information about how little regard there is within the government and within some broadcasters for how small the audiences on TV are. So that was a really fascinating interview. I talked to a professional footballer who's playing in the top flight at the moment, in the Premier League at the moment, who is embarrassed by the amount of money he earns and largely gives it all away. And he talked to me about what his life was like and how he gets £200,000 into his bank account every month and has done for pretty much 15 years now. And he said, I just don't need any more money. The fact that we just keep getting money endlessly is he thinks it's immoral. So he makes plans to give it all away and to dispute it. I talked to a coach in the game who said he thought the money had ruined it because it just basically had spoiled the relationship between fans and players and managers and players because people. So he also thought it had increased the abuse culture because people are paying so much. I see these people earning ridiculous amounts of wages. They feel justified in abusing them in any way whatsoever, in a way that never used to quite be the case. But I also talked to lots of broadcasters, all the major commentators I spoke to as well. There's loads of information from the inside of football in the book. It isn't just me shouting from the rooftops about mad ideas I've had. I actually talked to other people to say, I basically wanted to go to people who work in the business and go, I've had these ideas. Am I crazy? And the answer came back, you are crazy, but this is sensible. This is just so like I mean, I put it at one point. When you are in an extreme position, as we are now, I think we're in an extreme economic model. The centre ground looks a long way away. So all I'm talking about is just having a kind of a more sane financial structure to how it all works out, and about having, which we haven't talked about yet, but having football on free-to-air television for the greater good. And I make an economic argument for that. But it seems extreme. What I'm talking about seems extreme, naive, and probably idealistic. But that's only because we dwell on the margins of sanity at the moment, where we are, the average Premier League wage, the average wage is $3 million a year, and plenty around 20. So I think, we're just really, because we've had something that is extremist, really normalised. So my thinking seems a long way from that, but really it's just common sense, a lot of it. But we've just been led away from common sense by the glitter of gold.
Yeah, the glitter of gold. I mean, that would probably be a good subtitle to the book too. And in many ways, I mean, we could go on for hours about this, John, because we really appreciate you coming on the show. We've had you on the past quite a few times when it was the EPL Talk podcast. Now, of course, the World Soccer Talk podcast. So, and we've enjoyed from afar, from across the pond, reading your columns at Football 365. For listeners who want to indulge themselves, not just on your book, John, but on some of your writings, where's the best place to go to read up on your great articles?
Well, I'll say if you go to johnnicholsonwriter.co.uk, you'll find all my non-fiction books there. But also, I'm a crime novelist as well these days. Since last time I talked to you, I developed a career as a crime novelist. And I have a mere 16 novels that are available there as well. And you can get them in bookshops and on Amazon as well. But yes, I've got all of that. Obviously, I do 2 things a week for Football 365. Still doing that. My 20th year now doing that. So yeah, that's where I live. So come and join me at some point if you can.
Okay, Kartik, let's move on to TV streaming news. Since we took a week break over the holidays for Christmas, we've got a lot of news to catch up on. And first of all, have you started off?
Yeah, might have noticed we haven't heard Peter Drury the last few weeks, and that's because he's taken a leave of absence to take care for his mother who is ill. No word on when he'll return to commentating, but in the meantime, he's been replaced by Gary Weaver for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and that's the thing, though, too, is like sometimes you don't know how popular somebody is until they're not there, and then there's a whole bunch of people that respond, asking where he is and giving thoughts. And on social media, I mean, Peter Drury is a very mixed reaction in terms of most soccer fans. Some people love him, some people don't like him. But I mean, he is one of the top commentators for the Premier League, and there's been a ton of people on social media that have asked me and others, Jim Beglin especially, what's been happening, and so that's why Peter's not on as much as we're used to having him on. So hopefully he'll be back soon. In the next news item, beIN Sports has recently announced that beIN Sports Extra will be available immediately in 15 major markets across the US on HC2 stations. So it's HC2 stations in Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, Dallas-Fort Worth, Houston, San Jose, San Francisco, Oakland, Atlanta, Miami, Fort Lauderdale, San Diego, Salt Lake City, Hartford, Columbus, Las Vegas, and Austin, among others. HC2 Broadcasting has 195 operational stations in over 130 US markets, including 34 of the top 35 markets across the United States. According to a beIN Sports executive, beIN Sports is now the first network to air advertiser-friendly live sports 24/7 on broadcast channels to nearly 7 million households. So I think we need to almost deconstruct this a little bit just to make sure that everybody understands. So this is not beIN Sports, the main channel, or beIN Sports en Español, the Spanish channel. It's beIN Sports Extra, which is their free channel, which is available, as we announced a couple of weeks ago, on Roku, as well as on beINSportsExtra.com. What it is it's select programming from beIN Sports. So there's a lot of Ligue 1 matches, some La Liga matches, but it does not contain any Real Madrid, Barcelona, or Atleti matches. Those are not included on this. And so that channel now, beIN Sports Extra, the free channel, is available over the air in select cities. What about you, Kartik? I'm not sure if you've had a chance to kind of check and see HC2 and basically if you have some rabbit ears that you can put in and check to see, but have you had a chance to look at this?
I have not, but my understanding is if you connect your rabbit ears to the TV, you can get a digital HD2. You can get the HC2 stations in this market, in the Fort Lauderdale, Miami Fort Lauderdale market, and beIN Sports Extra is now available.
Yeah, it's a workaround because, I mean, obviously, still beIN Sports is not on DirecTV and is not on Comcast. It'll probably never be back on Comcast. DirecTV is always a possibility, although it's owned by AT&T, so maybe not. And this is a workaround that beIN Sports has done and say, okay, how can we get our programming on available to consumers directly, kind of circumventing the cable and satellite companies, and they've done that through the Roku with the beIN Sports Extra channel. Now they're doing this through this HC2 for the free-to-air channels. We'll get more into this into the listener mailbag, where we've got some questions about this. Next up, Kartik, some big news from Major League Soccer.
Yeah, MLS has unveiled its 25th season broadcast schedule details, which features an all-time high 46 network broadcast windows across ABC, Fox, Univision, and Unimas. In the U.S., the National League broadcast matches will be available in both English and Spanish language through ABC, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN Deportes, as well as Fox, FS1, Fox Deportes. There is a separate slate of matches that will also air on Univision, Unimas, and TUDN. ESPN will broadcast a total of 31 matches, including 10 on ABC, which is the most since the 1999 season, by the way, so the most in over 20 years. Univision will see 32 games across Univision and Unimas, with all games simulcast on TUDN. 14 games will air on Univision Network and 18 matches on Unimas. The 14 games on Univision are quite a coup. We see the ratings for those matches, even for Liga MX games, tend to be significantly higher.
Yeah, more games on over-the-air television is good news for soccer fans, no matter what league you watch. What it does for Major League Soccer is that it has the potential to bump up the numbers. So, for example, for 2019 compared to 2018, numbers were down. But for 2020, it's very likely that with all these games on over-the-air television, the numbers for 2020 will be up compared to 2019. So it's a good story. It's a good story to give to advertisers and to the ESPNs and Univisions and Foxes of the world in terms of when the rights come up for renewal in 2022. Also, it's a good thing to talk to Amazon or talk to DAZN or CBS or anyone else who might be interested in bidding on Major League Soccer rights, is if MLS can come in at the end of 2020 and say, hey, look at this the numbers we got this season. This season were much higher than last season, and don't look at the numbers too closely to see that actually a lot of these games are on over-the-air television. But the other thing too, it's accessibility. It makes Major League Soccer more accessible to soccer fans, where it makes it easier for them to come across games, to find games, instead of games being stuck on ESPN+. TV ratings, we won't go into a lot of them because we will publish them at worldsoccertalk.com. But also with the holidays too, some of the numbers are delayed. But what we do know, the two big numbers, first of all, for the Liga MX final, the first leg, which was at home for Monterrey against Club America, this game was on Fox Deportes. Fox has the rights to Monterrey's home games, and this was on last Thursday night. The viewership for this one was 1.3 million viewers. It was also on FS1 live, which actually, Kartik, we didn't mention that. So FS1, I watched. I know you mentioned it, but I watched the game in English on FS1. Kobe Jones co-commentating, and I think it was Adrian Garcia Marquez. I think it was doing the lead commentary. Kobe and Adrian seem to have their own language when they're commentating games, like a lot of weird expressions or descriptions of things that are happening. I mean, Kobe Jones talking about a player getting hit in the groin, and he was talking about getting hit in the trunk. And they're just strange things that Kobe and Adrian said that kind of turned me off to the actual broadcast, the commentary. But nonetheless, I believe the FS1 number, which hasn't been reported, but it's approximately about 100,000 viewers watched that game in English. It'll be interesting to see what the second leg of that is on Univision and TUDN. I'm sure it's a huge number. And then El Clasico. which is almost forgotten in all of this, Kartik, because, I mean, I watched it. It was a boring game. It was Wednesday, 2 p.m. kickoff. It was, not a lot of enthusiasm for El Clasico, especially with it being on a weekday during office hours. 354,000 viewers tuned into this one to watch it on beIN Sports and beIN Sports in Espanol combined, which is not... that's not a good number if that's your flagship game for the biggest match of the year. The first of two for La Liga. To me, that is not impressive. All right, listener mailbag. We've got a bunch to catch up here on, Kartik. Some great feedback from our listeners. First up is Robert. And Robert says, I am a big fan of John Nicholson, and he's partly the blame for getting me so stirred up. It will be great that you will have him on the podcast. There was a similar book from 2014 called Taking Our Ball Back by Martin Cloak. It covered much of the same ground. John, the Fiver crew, and I all see the world much the same way. Great show. Did not expect so many of my comments to make the show. Now will the comments about the podcast throw some tomatoes my way? Or tomatoes. I don't no tomatoes going Robert's way this time. I think Robert's spot on in terms of some of his thoughts and welcome feedback. Next up is Jiminy. And this is in response to, I think, some of the comments that you made, Kartik. I don't think Rebecca or any other presenter is viewed as a journalist or with an expectation that they should only speak in facts. Maybe the issue is with the American audience's interpretation and the American idea that there is or should be a clear-cut best league. Any
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Jiminy's right because I always get questions. Oh, is this the best league? Is that the best league? That's, I think, a very American thing that everything has to be the best. Everything has to be the top. Everything has to be better than anything American has to be better than anything that's not American, right?
Yeah.
That's an American mentality. So I think the Premier League fits into that same thing as all these Americans who have adopted the Premier League or have come to football through the Premier League. It has to be the best league in the world. And again, there is a certain arrogance about the Premier League. I direct back to, and if people haven't watched it, watch ESPN FC. If you have ESPN Plus, you can go back and watch the Sunday, December 29th, ESPN FC. Stuart Robson makes very clear that he believes a lot of these problems with the Premier League, particularly with VAR, are due to their own arrogance and their own self-belief that they're somehow superior to every other league and every other form of football. So I think it kind of is maybe a direction from the league as well. But I agree with Jiminy. I think it's part of its American mentality. Yeah,
one more thing to add to what Jiminy says is that I hate how comparisons are made to American sports oftentimes. Like from this past week, this past weekend, I think I saw a headline or an article that talks about how Diego Maradona is the Babe Ruth of soccer. And to me, I had a laugh at that because it probably doesn't exist in that you wouldn't do the same to soccer. That you wouldn't have like Babe Ruth is the Diego Maradona of baseball. It's one of those things that comparisons are drawn oftentimes, which are just. I mean, soccer's to me strong enough and different enough that
many Americans are uncomfortable in their soccer knowledge that they have to make these analogies. That's part of the thing I've noticed with people who are general sports people. I always have to make a comparison. Oh, is it the Manchester Derby like Auburn, Alabama, or something like that, right? Or Maradona being the Babe Ruth. I mean, come on, no one, everybody around the world knows who Maradona is. I don't think many people knew who Babe Ruth was, but it's I think insecurity.
Next up is Azar, and Azar says, Clive Tilsley corrected himself in the same breath when he announced the wrong final score in one of the games from the weekend. Not a big deal. But Arlo White, in the 36th minute, started talking about the 2019 Women's World Cup in France. He asked Phil Neville about the USA against England game and what he thought about the USA performance. He then asked Phil to assess the US women's national team. The conversation turned to the 2020 She Believes Cup in Orlando, when the two sides will meet again. Dear God, when is this embarrassment going to end? And that's a good comment too, because I think it oftentimes, I mean, if you interview, which I have done, you interview NBC Sports executives, especially at the higher level, their philosophy, their mission is that they don't want to get in the way of the sport. They want the sport, the game itself, to do the talking. And I think Arlo oftentimes, kind of interjects himself in that and kind of disrupts the flow, where we just want to enjoy the game. We want the commentary of the game itself that we're watching. We're not watching this game to hear what Phil Neville has to say about the US women's national team or the England women's national team. Otherwise, I mean, that could be a separate conversation. That could be they do a lot of the interview series. They did one with Jamie Vardy. I think Arlo did that. And you mean kind of a sit-down interview. That's a good opportunity to ask those types of questions. We do not want to tune into a game to listen to Phil Neville talking about something that has nothing to do with the game itself. Go ahead.
Well, I'll tell you where it could have been applicable this weekend, okay? Because I think I think the very first time we saw VAR interpreted in a serious fashion, the way we saw the Pookie goal called back or the Wolves goal called back when Johnny maybe offside, maybe not. Was in the England-US game that's being referred to when England were denied what would, prior to VAR, have been a perfectly good goal. I don't think there would have been many American players or American fans sticking their hand up saying that's offside, unless they're just hopefully doing it. That changed the complexion of that World Cup. I mean, I'm right. Very proud and very happy the U.S. won the World Cup. My belief is if that goal had not been disallowed, England would have pushed on to win that match. They were on the front foot, and they probably beat Holland. They probably win the World Cup.
That would have been the
thing to bring up. That would have been the thing to bring up, not the She Believes Cup, not the rematch. I think it's very applicable because there's been more and more talk about that England-US game just with my own circle of friends the last 4 days, because we saw we thought the Premier League, particularly from that incident, because it involved England and it cost England the potential to win a World Cup, that they would have applied VAR differently, because the Premier League publicly had talked about watching the Women's World Cup, knowing the mistakes in application of VAR in the Women's World Cup with offside and with goalkeepers coming off their line early and encroachment on penalties. And they said that they had taken note of the mistakes and they were going to fix it in their own implementation of VAR. They did not. They've done the implementation is exactly the same, if not worse. Mm-hmm. So that would have been the topic that Arlo and Phil should have discussed. Maybe they're not allowed to go there. Maybe it's league prohibition, which goes back to maybe the entire theme of this show. Why they wouldn't discuss that specifically?
Yeah, I don't think there's any censorship. I think there's some topics that they will not go deep on. I mean, because in many ways they want to kind of maintain that good relationship, that good working relationship with them, with the Premier League, with the hopes that in terms of the next renewal rights that there's nothing negative that comes up. I think the Premier League would be okay with the discussion anyway, though too. But the time and place for it is not during a commentary of a game that's happening as ebb and flow of the game, where a split second later something else could happen. Where now it's during halftime, post match, pre match. Or at another time, but not during the actual commentary of the game. To me, the commentary is sacred. It's a sacred time, and it's one of those things I love listening to commentators. But Azza brings up some good points here about Arlo. Leonid says, also in the last podcast, you talked about how the Premier League creates problems for the domestic leagues in English-speaking countries, such as the United States, etc. I completely agree, except that this problem is not only in English-speaking countries. In Norway, for example, the Premier League is the most popular league, and even representatives of the Norwegian league do not believe that there will come a time when the domestic league in Norway will receive at least a third of the Premier League TV audience, and that is how the Premier League is perceived in Norway. Next up is Daniel McCurry. And actually, when I went to Norway a couple of years ago on vacation and was in Bergen, and Liverpool was playing. There was Liverpool bars everywhere and tons and streams of Liverpool supporters walking out of that pub at that time. Daniel McCurry says, watching the match on NBCSN with Rob Palmer and Ian Dowie commented on a potential handball. For me, that's not a handball, Ian Dowie said. The handball rule was just clarified this season, so don't give us your opinion on if that was a handball when you played in the 80s. Tell us how the current rule applies here. When Theo Walcott fouled a Newcastle player, the ensuing free kick led to a goal, but the commentator informed us that Walcott kicking the player inadvertently wasn't a foul. Again, maybe in 1980, but that's not a foul, but it's clearly a foul in 2019. I love the Premier League, but when these old school play for the shirt, that's not a foul in my day crap pops up, it's a huge turnoff. For all the effort to push the cosmopolitan image of the Premier League, there's still lots of these old school, grumpy former player managers floating around in the media. Wow, Daniel, some good comments there. Yeah, I mean, and this is not just the Premier League too, but you mean whether it's Major League Soccer, whether it's U.S. men's national team games. I mean, a lot of these leagues, a lot of the commentators and co-commentators are not up to speed on the rules, and are, you mean, not studying it. I'd say it's like Taylor Twellman is somebody that seems to study everything and has a conscious effort of making sure that he's up to date on the latest things. Unfortunately, it's not the case for a lot of other commentators. Nash Rambler says, Kartik and Christopher, I saw a video of the announcement of the Charlotte MLS team, and the owner-to-be said essentially that finally there would be a professional sports team in Charlotte for the Hispanic community. This has prompted me to ask both of you about the size of the Hispanic audience for MLS attendance and TV viewing based on your own observations as well as any market research either of you have seen. Am I wrong to think that most of the Hispanic population of Mexican descent in the US are following Liga MX much more than Major League Soccer? And am I too cynical to believe that the new Charlotte owners' hyping of the Hispanic appeal is more of a PR exercise than anything based in reality?
Yeah, so the person who will be largely responsible for running the Charlotte club is Tom Glick, who was the chairman of Darby County before the consortium of American owners that he represented, General Sports, I think they were called, sold the club to Mel Morris, who's the current owner, who was a local from Derbyshire. So he was based in Derby and actually visited. I visited in 2011 Pride Park in Derby County. He then moved to Manchester City as a not as the chief executive, but as I think the chief marketing officer, and was there for a while. Got moved by City Football Group to New York when he ran the New York when New York FC launched. Then he switched to work for the NFL, Carolina Panthers club, right? Mm-hmm. So it sounds like he's going to have a large influence on the direction of where Charlotte markets. I think he's somebody who understands the sport and launched New York City FC and MLS, and then also, as I said, has worked for two clubs in high senior management in England. So I'm a little more hopeful they'll make this connection than other clubs that have launched, with the exception of Atlanta. But by and large, these clubs in MLS do not connect with the Latino fan base the way Liga MX does or other leagues do. So yeah. I think maybe Charlotte can be an example. I think Charlotte is an example of a city with a lot of recent immigration and a lot of recent demographic changes. So I think that was the thing that made Atlanta so interesting, was that Atlanta had evolved from being kind of this capital of the South, but this very kind of Southern feeling place, even with CNN based there, even with Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines from there in the 1990s when they hosted the Olympics, to being this very cosmopolitan destination for immigrants from Latin America and from Africa and Asia that has now made Atlanta United this incredible story. So Charlotte has some of those elements, but the playbook in MLS hasn't been executed very well. So I'm hopeful that Glick and the Charlotte group can do that, but it will be an uphill struggle. Yeah,
I think it's Charlotte projecting. So it's projecting to the future, thinking that they want to capture that Hispanic market, that audience, and they know that Hispanic soccer fans are very passionate, it goes through not just, it goes through the families. It is very much a kind of a family event type of thing. It goes through generations. And I think that's something that they want to attract, they want to appeal to, and that they're not there yet. And that's why I think some of the things that was mentioned here from what Nash Rambler said, that the person said, are a little bit exaggerated. Obviously, in terms of TV viewing, the Hispanic audience for Liga MX is much, much, much greater than for Major League Soccer. The one market that I would say that is doing exceedingly well for especially Mexican Americans or of Mexican descent is LAFC, and that's a good example of kind of a more of an urban team that's done a great job of the marketing, and that potentially could be something that Charlotte can look at to see, okay, are there things that they can learn from that. But overall, though, too, I agree with Nash Rambler in terms of this is kind of over exaggeration in terms of where they are right now. Now, where they want to be, that's a different story, and that's what they're aiming for, I'm sure. Next up is Rico Richardson, and Rico says, I don't think expansion is the problem when it comes to Major League Soccer. The league is just lacking effort in promoting their brand. Most cities don't consider Major League Soccer Major League because it doesn't present itself as such. Also, I don't think there is a real benefit for MLS if they're ever going to merge both Liga MX and Major League Soccer. Major League Soccer is going to struggle on television and hardly have any national profile in the mainstream American sports. And that's a good point too from Rico too, is that this idea or possibility of Liga MX and Major League Soccer merging together or finding new ways to kind of play together or work together could actually hurt Major League Soccer in the long run, because it could be one of those things where Liga MX takes more of a control or more of an influence or more popularity, where the Liga MX side grows, where Major League Soccer, maybe the interest kind of plateaus or drops a little bit, where it's opening Liga MX to a whole new audience of American English language fans that might be more captivated with that league and the playing style and quality as opposed to Major League Soccer, or maybe not. Monty Reed says, in the podcast you mentioned that beIN Sports cannot stream FC Barcelona and Real Madrid matches on their new beIN Sports Extra channel. Since beIN now has over-the-air channels, that is broadcasting beIN Sports Extra channel, could they broadcast these matches on the over-the-air channel? How likely will cable companies add this new channel to their local channel group? So just to clarify, this over-the-air channel, beIN Sports Extra, will not have Barcelona, Real Madrid, or Atleti games. There is actually a schedule on beinsportsextra.com where they have the programming schedule. You can see what's coming up. It's not all soccer. I mean, they've got other sports too that they're trying to promote. It's really kind of a way to promote the beIN Sports channel. And I don't see it very likely that cable companies will add this channel to their local channel groups. Maybe some kind of small tier ones may, but it's unlikely that some of the big ones, such as Comcast or others, would. It's more likely, if anything, like we mentioned in last week's podcast, is that they're going to try and find other ways, like whether it's Pluto TV or other streaming services that have. Crackle has free movies and things. There's probably lots of opportunities for free ways to get programming on different apps out there. Bill Reese says, in case any executives at the Bundesliga's American offices listen to this podcast, I'd like to give you all a free idea. The Bundesliga should host a fan fest similar to the Premier League's fan fest. What do you think about having? What do you have that the English don't? Oktoberfest. The Bundesliga should pick a weekend in September and host an Oktoberfest-themed fan fest somewhere in the US, complete with beer, bratwurst, and of course some top-flight German Fußball. If it were in New York, I would host it on Governor's Island. Like ESPN Plus, it's not exactly off the beaten path, but it's well worth the effort if you need to travel there. I like the idea. However, I think it's been done, Kartik, because I know Fox Sports, was it maybe 2 years ago or maybe 3 years ago, had a studio broadcast of a game. It might have been Der Klassiker, where they had all the Bundesliga, the Bayern Munich fans and the Dortmund fans in the studio. I think Alexi Lalas was there. I think Kate Abdo was there too. And it was kind of an audience in the studio watching the game. I thought it was typical Fox. I thought it was really poorly promoted. Like, very few people knew about this happening until the day of the game. There was no kind of, with the NBC Fan Fest, whether you like it or don't like it, months in advance that this thing is happening. That there's excitement building, suspense building, there's registration. Are you going to be able to actually make the list to get there? This kind of supply and demand. Not a lot of supply, but a lot of demand. So it builds up. And with Fox, it was kind of, they did it. They didn't promote it. They probably promoted it within the Bayern Munich supporters groups and the Dortmund supporters groups. But you need to go beyond that. And Bill's idea, I think, is a great idea, is open it up and have something that's much, much bigger. Unfortunately, I think the time is up for Fox and the Bundesliga. Maybe ESPN might take that idea. And we know that ESPN executives listen to this show. Kartik, last up is Azar, and he says, you guys talked about ESPN FC talking about the Bundesliga more than its current rights holder, Fox Sports. The only problem is next August, the only thing you will see on the ESPN family of networks is college football. All right, so if you want to have your say, we'd love to get your feedback, whether it's comments or questions or observations or rants or raves, particularly if it's anything in regards to the soccer media. This is, after all, World Soccer Talk podcast, the only soccer podcast that focuses on the soccer media in terms of what we're watching, whether it's on television, online, or apps. We'd also like to wish everyone a happy new year, and thank you for listening in 2019. It's been a great year. We've had some good guests on, and we're looking forward to 2020 with the show getting bigger and better than ever. And so if you do have any feedback for us, you can always reach us via email through web at worldsoccertalk.com, as well as facebook.com/worldsoccertalk, and on Twitter at worldsoccertalk. Plus, of course, you can post your comments on worldsoccertalk.com, the flagship website. And Kartik, before we close, any final thoughts here on 2019 and any observations for 2020?
Yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see two things we talked about in this show. beIN, how they continue to position themselves in 2020, and ESPN Plus's rollout for the Bundesliga. And then, of course, keep an eye on CBS for more media moves from them potentially. They are going to lose SEC football, which is maybe their flagship property on the sports side. So there is increasing bandwidth and I think an increasing desire for them to get into the soccer business just to fill programming.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in for 2020 in Turner Sports and what they do with the Champions League, whether they take the pedal off and just coast and just or if they put in a lot of effort to try to improve the product and build. Bleacher Report really is what they're pushing. Bleacher Report Live and some of those digital products or digital places as being stronger and greater analysis. Thus far, they've tried a lot of things, but it's been such a frustrating experience, and it's improved from where it started. But this could be a good opportunity for them to continue and maybe bring in some fresh faces and try some different things and try to save some face, because I know they've made a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of bad first impressions. Plus, of course, where the Premier League goes from here too. I mean, that's going to be interesting to see what NBC Sports does in trying to elevate their coverage and whether they've hit a peak or whether they can continue advancing that level of analysis, etc. So thank you for listening. You can get a new episode of the World Soccer Talk podcast every Thursday. Every episode is released on SoundCloud, Spotify, Pandora, YouTube, Stitcher, iTunes, TuneIn, Audio Boom, Overcast, and worldsoccertalk.com. If you like the show, share it with your friends on social media, and we'd greatly appreciate it if you can give us a review on iTunes, whether you like, dislike, or the show. Any feedback would be most welcome. And Kartik, heading into another weekend, we've got a lot of football. We've had so much football for the last couple of weeks, and heading into the New Year's, we've got a whole bunch of matches on New Year's Day and beyond. It's been a great ride, but what should they do?
Enjoy your football.